Hello and welcome to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, How America Culture Came to Be, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel. Today we are discussing clothes. Not styles, not outfits, not shoes, but a simple question of how much clothes cost in the past. Alex had a crazy thought on how we can relate this to the present, and I'm going to let him discuss that.
Often when I am interpreting on the German farm site, processing flax, a labor-intensive, basically pure drudgery type of job, a job that seems to take forever, I always wonder how many hours went into producing one article of clothing, and how much did it cost? The second part of the question is, could you relate it to something of today?
So that sounds like an interesting idea, but you're kind of being a bit vague, so you need to refine your parameters, and then we can try to figure it out. The simple answer is that clothes cost a lot less in the past, and therefore most people until very recently had very few clothes.
So here's my thought, and this is my thought before I started doing the research on the topic, and really, I wish I had a better thought. It is to figure out the cost of an outfit for two people in the mid-17th century and see if it's comparable to buying a brand new car today.
A new car? Okay, so let me get this straight. You're suggesting that buying a set of clothes in the past is like buying a new car today? There's a huge difference in the prices of cars today, which is similar in the prices of clothing in the 17th century, I guess. The rich and elite in the 17th century were not buying the same value of clothing as the average person, and I guess the same could be true today in regard to cars. Pretty much the difference between a Maserati and a Prius. Still, I'm not really sure about this comparison. Simply the valuation of items between periods are so different it's impossible to compare items from the past to items of the present. Still, close to car comparison, this is out there.
Yes, it is. Still, not as far-fetched as you might think. Clothes become much cheaper due to the Industrial Revolution. So for the comparison to make sense, the time period has to be before the 18th century, before textile innovations like carded mills, spinning jennies have been invented. So for this comparison, we are going to use the date of the museum's English farm, smack dead in the middle of the 17th century. Consequently, with this date, all of the work in making clothes is powered by humans. Well, almost. Spinning wheels are an amazing invention over a drop spindle, and while a machine, in the sense of the word, it is still powered by the operator. The one part of the process powered by water wheels in the 17th century is fulling and beetling mills. More on this later in the podcast. My thought was to see if you can figure out how many hours it took to make these clothes and see if it was comparable to the number of hours one has to work to buy a car. People who work 40-hour-a-week job will work 2,080 hours per year. In this scenario, the poor person didn't have a vacation or any days off in the year. The person earned $15 per hour, which works out to $31,200 per year, and then bought a brand new car that costs exactly $31,200. Now the question is, would it take 2,080 hours of labor to make an outfit for one man and one woman in 1660s England? Now, I just looked to see what is the average modern salary in Virginia, and it comes out to $64,607. Sadly, I'm kind of depressed by that figure, but that's a different matter. I went for the lower rate, a rate that might be minimum wage in Virginia in a few years' time, as it corresponds with the fact that most people in the 17th century were very poor.
The biggest issue on this is it's going to be very difficult to figure out how many hours of labor went into making specific items of clothing. Now, there are other ways to figure out how expensive clothes are than the amount of labor required to make them. The easiest is simply to find out the price of an article of clothing in the mid-17th century and use a purchasing power calculator to compare it to today's prices. Lucky for us, there's a website called measuringworth.com that does this comparison. You put in the value in the year and it will give you the value in today's money. The British National Archives also has a currency calculator on their website, and this one not only gives you the value in today's money, but also compares it to what else you could buy for the same amount of money in the given year. So, I now know that 10 pounds in 1660 will buy you one horse. And considering that I definitely have 10 pounds in my British bank account, I would like that to still hold true.
Now, the perfect resource to use in figuring out how much clothes cost in the 17th century is Samuel Pepys and his diary of the 1660s. He was a vain man and kept a detailed list of the clothes he bought and how much he spent on them. He wrote on October 31st, 1663, "Thence to the office were busy till night, and then to prepare my monthly account, about which I stayed till 10 or 11 o'clock at night. To my great sorry, find myself 43 pounds worse than I was last month, which was 760 pounds, and now it is 717 pounds. But it has chiefly arisen from my laying out in clothes for myself and my wife, viz. For her 12 pounds, and for myself 55 pounds, or thereabouts, having made myself a velvet cloak, 2 new cloth suits, back paying both, a new shag gown, trimmed with gold buttons and twists, with a new hat and silk tops for my legs, being resolved to go like myself.
There are so many things I could say about Pepys, and have, but the baseline is he was a vain man, a dandy, and he had the means to dress like the upper class. Also, only 12 pounds on his wife and 55 pounds spent on himself? Really? As a coworker just mentioned, that would be grounds for divorce today. But if we put the figure of 67 pounds into the currency calculators, we come up with a figure of approximately 10,410 pounds. If we convert the figure to dollars, going at the current exchange rate, the figure Pepys spent on clothes in October of 1663 is $14,410. Interestingly, one could buy, on average in the 1660s, 10 horses or 12 cows, and the average skilled craftsman would need to work 957 days to earn 67 pounds, or roughly 2 years and 6 months of work. Keeping in mind inflation exists, which again makes this exercise a bit of a stretch and almost unbelievable for today's evaluation of items. But let's continue.
Now, I would say $14,410 could buy you a pretty good used car today. And more interestingly to me is it took 2 years, 6 months for the average skilled tradesman to earn this amount of money. Still, I know of no one today who spends that much on clothes, including my daughter, who loves to spend all of her money on clothes. Still, this does not answer the question how many hours of labor it takes to make these clothes, and more importantly, the average English person is not buying these clothes. So let us first figure out how many articles of clothing we are talking about and discuss what the poorer and middle sorts of clothing people were buying in the 17th century.
Yes, this is an area the museum has a lot of documentation on and has done a lot of research into these matters. Let's start off with a woman, a yeoman woman of the year 1660. She would wear on a typical day stockings, which take 2 skeins of yarn per stocking, and that's about 16 hours of knitting per pair of stockings. 2 to 3 petticoats, taking 3 to 4 yards of fabric per petticoat, which averages out to about 12 hours of labor for each petticoat. A bodice and stays, which is made of linen, leather, and whalebone, based on size, about 16 to 12 hours to make one. A shift, 2 to 3 yards of fabric, about 10 hours of sewing. The jacket over the bodice, 2 to 3 yards of fabric, about 24 hours of sewing. A collar, about a quarter yard of fabric, which usually would be linen, 4 to 6 hours of sewing. An apron, half yard of linen, 4 hours of sewing. A coif, or headpiece, quarter to half yard of probably linen fabric, 4 hours of sewing. Plus shoes and hat, which we are not including in this exercise, equals about 8 to 12 yards of fabric and 90 to 100 hours of sewing to make the items. For the man, he would start with his shirt, 2 yards of fabric, most likely linen, about 10 hours of sewing. Breeches, 3 yards of fabric, either linen or wool, 16 hours of sewing. The doublet, linen or wool, 2 to 3 yards of fabric, 20 hours of sewing. Jerkin, usually made of leather, about 1.5 to 2 yards, 18 hours of sewing. Stockings, 2 skeins, again 16 hours of knitting for the pair. Neckwear, some kind of collar or kerchief, about a quarter yard of fabric, most likely linen, about 4 hours of sewing. Now, if you're a cavalier, on the other hand, your collar is going to be much larger, probably about a yard of fabric, either some kind of linen or lace, 4 hours of sewing. And then you also have your garters, which is knitted or a strip of cloth, about an hour to make. Shoes and hats, again, not part of the exercise. That equals 10 to 12 yards of fabric and about 90 to 100 hours of sewing to make the items of clothing. So we're talking 180 to 200 hours of labor just to make the clothes for 2 people, or roughly about 4 to 5 weeks of the average work week today, working solely on these specific items and working at a consistent pace for cutting, sewing, and knitting.
To put this in perspective, the average person today can outfit themselves on 1 day of work. We tested this theory by asking everyone at work how much do they spend on clothes they were wearing. The biggest expense was on shoes, but taking shoes out of the equation, no one spent more than $100 on their outfit for any day. Now, we all work at a museum, so none of us is rich, and mostly we all bought clothes on sale often used to be more earth-conscious and casual in nature. Often the cost was under $50 for the complete outfit, including one person who thought the amount she spent on her clothes was less than $10. These clothes were bought used. People of the 17th century would be gobsmacked over how cheap clothes are today.
Yes, but what is really amazing, and this is the easy part of the equation, now we are talking about linen and wool cloth for the 17th century, and the difficult and really most time-consuming is turning flax into linen fabric and wool into woolen fabric. Now, the debate Alex and I have been having over the past few weeks as we discuss this topic is figuring out the average time required to this process. I'm really skeptical that we can actually prove this.
Well, there are parts of the process that can be figured out. We will start with flax. Flax is a crop, and the more I looked into flax production, a little does go a long way. There are too many variables to figure out how much fabric an acre produces, but the common thread, no pun intended, is a quarter of an acre should produce enough fabric to outfit 2 to 4 people. Now, the first step in growing flax is plowing and harrowing a field. A team of horses can plow an acre a day. A team of oxen can plow a half an acre per day. The field might be plowed many times over before it's actually ready for planting. And usually you have a step of harrowing, which is taking spike teeth onto its usually a triangle, and then run up and down the field to even it out just before you plant. And then acre is 43,560 square feet. 1 pound of flaxseed plants about 15 square feet. Therefore, one needs 193 pounds of flaxseed to plant an acre. This is about a week's work for 2 people in regards to plowing, harrowing, and planting the flaxseed. Once the field is planted, not much needs to be done until the crop is harvested. Flax is harvested by pulling the plant out of the ground. When you are harvesting flax, it seems time stands still, and it takes forever. In reality, that is not the case. An acre of flax can be harvested in a day with 4 to 6 people. The plant is placed on the ground for a day to dry. The next day, it is bundled up into half-size sheaves, about 3 to 6 inches in size, depending on the size of your hand. Then the sheaves are stood up and leaning on other sheaves and left to dry in the field for a few days before brought into a barn or some sort of shelter. This really does not take much time. It is work, but maybe 2 to 4 people working together 2 to 3 weeks. The jobs are done in spurts when needed, and it is part of the work cycle of farm life. The next few steps in the process of turning flax into linen is where it gets crazy labor intensive.
The next step is rippling, which is the process of removing the seed pods from the stalk for planting purposes. However, the flax used for fiber is harvested before the seeds have a chance to develop, and most farmers would leave a quarter, maybe a bit less, for seeds for the next year. So we really do not have to include rippling in this equation. The fiber in flax is located between the outer shell and the inner core. The first step in retrieving the fiber from the stalks is to decay the flax plant in water for a few days so the inner core and outer shell will break. This process is called retting, and there are 2 ways of doing this. One is a process called dew retting, where the flax is left outside using the dew in the morning air to slowly decay the plant. This process is more common in Germany in areas where there might not be so many rivers or ponds. In Ireland and England, however, there are plenty of rivers and ponds, and often the flax is submerged into the ponds for 2 to 3 days. This part of the job goes very quickly, a few days at most, depending on how big your fast-flowing water is, how much water flows over your flax dam, and how much flax you can submerge at a time. The next step is to completely dry the flax before you begin the processing part of the job. Since England and Ireland are damp countries, the flax processors built kilns or dried the flax by the hearth fire. The next step is then breaking the outer skin and inner core by breaking up the stalk using a flax brake. A flax brake is a simple machine that's basically a bench with slats a few inches apart with an arm that swings down onto the bench. The arm also has slats spaced a few inches apart, and the slats on the bench and the arm overlap, so the inner core and outer skin break apart, leaving only the fiber. The next step is then scutching, scraping the chaff and woody pitch in the fibers off, and also straightening the fibers. The last step is hackling, running the fiber through a series of iron spikes, really iron combs. Each set of hackles has the spikes set closer together, kind of the difference between brushing and combing. What's left after this process is then ready for spinning.
Now, this is where I fell into a rabbit hole and nothing makes sense. Flax is processed 1 bundle at a time. We recently did a training session on flax processing at the museum, mainly because we are not doing a very good job and wasting a lot of fiber. Now, 1 bundle, which is a handful of flax, takes about 20 minutes to go through all the steps. So far, so good, except when you start plugging in numbers for the process in 1 acre of flax. Since an acre is 43,560 square feet, and one bundle of flax most likely was harvested from 1 square foot of land, therefore it is going to take forever to process an acre of flax. If it takes 20 minutes to bundle flax from 1 square foot of land, it will take 7,260 hours to process 1 acre of flax. There are only 8,760 hours in a year. Now, the work is divided into 3 parts, so each person is doing 2,420 hours of work, or almost 7 hours of flax processing per day. Now, we did say 1/4 of an acre might be sufficient to about 2 people, so the number is down to 634 hours per year per person, or about 2 hours of work per person per day, which is manageable, and more of it could be done in the winter months compared to the summer months. Yet this is only a small part of the process. We have not even mentioned spinning or weaving. The reason this becomes harder to figure out averages is no one, or really no family, is doing all these steps we just described. Each step is the process of turning flax into cloth is a separate trade and skill. The farmers plant the crops, then there are laborers, most likely laborers' families, who are processing the flax, then there are spinners and weavers. A weaver is mostly weaving. The weaver might be renting a small cottage with about 1 to 5 acres of land, enough to have a garden and maybe a cow or pig. The cloth pays for the rent and other expenses, while the land provides most of the food he eats. Labor was really cheap in the 17th century. The big expense is the materials and anything that is being made. This is the opposite of today, where labor is more expensive and materials are very cheap. Simply no trade person, being weavers, spinners, people processing the flax, is getting rich. The linen merchants, who are overseeing all aspects of the linen industry, are the ones who are making the money.
Now, this is where we get into problems. Besides all of these figures hurting my brain, we are trying to figure out the average time it takes to process flax to make a shirt, a shift, maybe a petticoat. Yet no one in the past looked at flax processing in that way. The laborers who were processing flax just processed flax. If they had flax to process, they did the work. The trouble is we are trying to get an average where no average really exists. We're being a little reductionist. The farmer might sell the flax to a linen merchant. The linen merchant might part out bundles of flax to laborers and pay them a certain amount of money to process it, or some variation of that process thereof. The goal of the merchant is to do this as cheaply as possible. No one looks at a field and thinks 3 shirts and a shift. It's very rare that a family will be growing flax, processing flax, spinning and weaving flax into linen cloth, all in-house. We do show at the museum an Irish farmer who was a weaver and a farmer, and there are examples of this in Ireland, but the farmer is going to act more as a business person, as he will have to hire people in this endeavor, because unless he has a very large family, he will not have enough help to do all the work. There's simply not enough time or family members to do all the jobs in growing crops and producing linen fabric while also growing food for subsistence, cooking said food, and child rearing. Some farmers might weave in the winter months, buying the thread or being paid to weave a certain amount of thread by a linen merchant when the needs of the farmer greatly reduced. Some families who are weavers might also be spinners. Put it simply, the women are the spinners and the men are the weavers. So there's a bit of division of labor there. If the woman is spinning, she's spinning hours and hours each day. The men are probably still doing other things while they're also weaving.
Now, we do have some numbers on the spinning and weaving part of the equation. Every weaving book I ever looked in suggests that a weaver makes about 22 yards of cloth at a time. That is usually 30 to 36 inches wide. This usually takes 6 weeks to produce. This is the amount of fabric we need to make one new outfit for a yeoman farmer and wife. The books also suggest that it takes 8 to 12 spinners to keep one weaver supplied with thread. Spinning was a career in the 17th century. Girls began to learn to spin at the very early age of 5.
The next step, once the thread has been turned into fabric, is to bleach the linen. This is done at specialized mills using washing tubs, chemicals, which is most likely urine broken down into ammonia, and bleaching greens, which are huge tracts of flat land where the fabric can be rolled out and the chlorine in the grass works on the fabric. We have no idea how long it takes to bleach the fabric, other than that it's entirely weather and atmospherically dependent. The next step in the process is beetling, which is raising the luster and softening the fabric by hammering the fabric with a water-powered hammer. Once again, we have no idea how long this takes on average, but it is a critical step for making linen a comfortable fabric for clothing. Then there's the matter of dyeing the fabric. This could take place at the bleaching mill or in a professional dyer's establishment where they have the necessary equipment like kettles, vats, and land to drought the fabric to dry, or it could even take place as a kind of craft-based industry where a woman takes in a certain amount of cloth to dye in her own house. Once all this is done, the fabric is then sold at market. This is where the individual needing clothes will purchase the fabric. And then it goes via the actual client to a tailor where it is made into clothes.
Now, if you add the hours of all the individuals that contributed in making enough linen fabric to make shifts, shirts, and petticoats, I think it might be a year's worth of work. Yet, and this is the maddening part, it is not that simple since no one is doing all the steps and with each part of the process being worked on at the same time. So within an area where a lot of flax is being grown, there will be farmers, laborers, spinners, weavers, a beetle mill, a bleaching, green, and dyeing mills. It is a job and you just grind away at it. The other complication in figuring out averages for how long it takes to make anything is there's a lot of unpaid labor doing much of the work. Since most of the work is done at home, children would contribute and spend hours and hours working each day. Weavers, spinners, really all aspects of the process would take on apprentices or hire servants to help with the work. These are usually young people and they are not paid. So a weaver is not making a certain amount of fabric for a specific purpose. He's making fabric, and when he finishes a bolt, he rewarps the loom and makes another bolt. Same with the spinner. She just spins, and as long as she has flax, the work continues. The more children, servants, apprentices have, the more money the weaver or spinner or farmer make.
The reductionist view is that, as in anything, labor is the basis of production and the economy. The labor force, however, is human and therefore works at different speeds, and therefore averages are difficult to come by. And this is not even beginning to mention the remunerative incentive, as better paid labor tends to work harder and faster, being more productive. This was definitely not the case, as labor was even more undervalued in the 17th century than now. But let's not get into modern economic politics. So we've just talked about linen. Quickly, we're going to go over wool production. The shirts and shifts would typically have been made of linen. Most of the other clothing mentioned in this list would have been made of wool.
Farmers are raising sheep. The owner of the English farmhouse we show at the museum had up to 100 sheep on average throughout the 17th century. Farmers raised the sheep, sheared the sheep, and then sold the fleeces to wool merchants. Now, it is impossible to figure out how much time in any given year a farmer spends raising sheep. We do know from records and actually shearing sheep, it takes 20 to 30 minutes to shear a sheep. I also say it is backbreaking work, and if I never have to shear a sheep again, I'll be happy. We have 4 inventories for our yeoman farmer, and on all of the inventories, there is no wool processing equipment. The next step is sorting, combing, or carding the wool, and mixing the different strains of wool to make a consistent cloth. A wool sorter was an extremely important trade and one that was paid better than most trades. This time-consuming, mind-numbing job is carding or combing wool. This is done using hand cards, and all the wool has to be carded before it can be spun. It takes longer to card than to spin. The washing and carding of wool is done using the putting-out system. Wool merchants pay families to wash and spin wool for a fee. This is the way for poor families to earn a little extra money. This system works well when the families have access to the common lands in the village to raise a cow or have land to plant a sizable garden. When common lands become enclosed starting in the 17th century, this system falls apart and these families become much, much poorer. The next step was spinning, and just like linen production, it takes 8 to 12 spinners to keep one weaver in thread.
At some point in wool processing, the wool is dyed into various colors. Wool can be dyed before any processing takes place, known as dyeing in the wool. It can also be dyed as yarn, which is known as dyed in the skein, or as the finished product itself. Dyes also come in different levels of expense and add to the cost of the garment, so colors often have to be considered when judging the likely price for an extant garment. Just like beetling for linen, wool cloth has to be fulled, fibers mashed together to make a better, longer-lasting fabric. This is done at a fulling mill, usually a water-powered mill with a big hammer pounding the wool. There are different categories of wool as well. The cheaper varieties are less finished and often considered hairier. The more expensive varieties are finished and much more smooth in appearance. Frieze wool, for example, is a bulky cloth with a raised hairy nap, spun and woven very loosely. Frieze wool makes a longer-lasting warm jacket, but is considered rather rough. Russet wool is dyed better, a bit softer fabric with more drape. Broadcloth is a harder-wearing but more processable fabric that was largely reserved for clothing, something that the average middling-class yeoman would be able to purchase. There are many more types of wool cloth, but the gist is that the less processing, the cheaper the cloth, therefore the more the common people are able to afford it for their clothes.
Like for linen, most of the wool-centric industry took place around villages. So the villages would have lots of spinners, weavers, and the surrounding area would have a high concentration of farmers specializing in raising sheep. A few years ago, my wife and I visited Levenham in Suffolk, a wool village. Wool villages were some of the wealthiest villages in England in the 13th through 15th centuries. Levenham is a perfect example with a beautiful parish church with a massive steeple, a church much bigger than you would think for the size of the village. It also has a beautiful timber-framed guild hall in the center and many beautiful timber-framed houses in town. These wool villages in the 16th century faced competition from mainland Europe and began a slow decline. The 17th century was at times very bad for the wool industry because of political instability and warfare in Europe and England. The 1620s and 1630s were particularly bad for the wool industry because of the 30 Years' War. Many of the Puritans who settled in New England in the 1630s were involved in the wool industry. These wool towns fell into decline, hence many of their medieval buildings survive until the present day. Now they are some of the most charming and beautiful English villages experience a rebirth because of tourism. Funny how fortunes of an area can change over time. I highly recommended visiting Levenham and having high tea in the Swan Inn. Commercial is now over.
Now, the same problem we have with linen is the same issue we have with wool, as it is impossible to figure out the averages for making woolen cloth when there are no averages. Carding wool is really time-consuming, but overall a very easy job to master. Children as young as 5 could be carding wool. So the families carding wool just got on with the job and did it pretty much every spare moment. People are never really idle, and late at night, sitting on stools around a fire, all the family might be carding, telling stories, singing. Does this count as work? Yes, but also for the time period, they might not consider it as real work. Carding is also a very useful 17th century fidget occupation. What else is one going to do when the sun goes down in the 17th century?
Everything changed in the 18th century in regards to cloth manufacturing. The first real labor-saving device in wool production was the invention of the carding mill in the 18th century. Carding mills prepared wool for spinning by aligning, straightening, and combing the fibers. This was a job previously done by hand carders. The new carding mills were a series of cones or cylinders with wire-like brushes. The mill is powered by pulleys using draft animals or water wheels. Carding mills took 20 minutes to card wool, which used to take all day to card by hand. A month's worth of hand carding could now be done in a day. The next improvement was combining a carding mill with a spinning wheel and a loom, the modern textile mill.
Now, let's go back to see if we can figure out the price for a more average set of clothing for the laboring class. Sam Pepys helps in this regard. So here is his diary entry for Monday, May 13th, 1667. Up and when ready, to the office, my wife rising and sent away Barker according to our resolution last night, and she did do it with more clothes than have cost us £10 and 20 shillings in her purse. Now, Samuel is tough on his servants. He writes often of how he berates them and paddles them. More shocking is that he often sleeps with them as well, even getting caught red-handed and then denying it to his wife, causing many, many days of marital strife, only solved by the buying of presents for his wife, and apparently also buying out his servants. We do not know what Barker's situation was for being let go. Most likely his wife found out about the sleeping with her. But from this account, the Pepys family clothed her for being their servant, which is common for the times. Using the currency calculator and translating it to dollars, the clothes gifted to a servant being let go come out to about $2,447. The value of the clothes in 1667 is equal to the purchase of one horse or wages amounting to 142 days of a skilled tradesman. So the real comparison for this situation is to compare 2 outfits to 4 to 5 months of your salary today. Not a bad deal for having been importuned by your employer, then losing your employment, especially since she could probably go on to sell the nice new clothes for a profit to the secondhand goods trade.
We have clearly established that clothes of the 17th century are expensive. Hence, an easy way of making quick money was to steal them. Sir John Scudamore in 1661 was walking in London where a gang of men robbed him. They stole his hat, cloak, breeches, doublet, shirt, and gloves. The value of his clothes was listed at 17 pounds 2 shillings. This amounts to 244 days, just over 8 months of wages for a skilled tradesperson. The robbers were caught and hung. So, Rachel, since it is winter, is your jacket and gloves and outfit you are wearing today worth 8 months of your salary?
No, not quite a day's work. So there's something really funny here. How about you?
No, like you, my outfit and jacket are worth day, maybe 2 days worth of work. My jacket is pretty nice, and I like to think it is worth something more than a day's worth of work. Sadly, it's probably not.
Continue on with this trend. My favorite clothes robbery concerns the biggest rake of the day, Lord Rochester. Pepys wrote, December 2nd, 1668, and heard the silly discourse of the king with his people about him, telling a story of my Lord Rochester's having his clothes stole, while he was with a wench, and all his gold gone, but his clothes found afterwards stuffed into a feather bed by the wench who stole them. I have a lot to say about the circumstances that allowed my lord to have his clothes stolen, and that good on her, she was taking the opportunity to gain far more than he probably paid for her services, but that's neither here nor there in this instance.
Now, here are two contrasts of London in regard to clothes, and sadly, the latter is depressing. The first is from our favorite diarist, Pepys. Pepys wrote on October 30th, 1664, up and in this morning put on my new fine colored cloth suit with my cloak lined with plush, which is dear and noble suit costing me about 17 pounds. Now we have an account from Joseph William Knight, writing about the quality of pressmen for the Navy in 1666 in the midst of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. The war was not going well for the English, and they needed more men for the Navy. The press gangs were going about the country looking for men to man the ships. Knight writes about some of them, pitiful fellows with no shirts and scare rags to cover them, and full sick in 3 of 4 days. Some so sick, not without suspicion of plague. This is the year after 1/4 of London's population died of plague. The contrast between the rich and poor is heartbreaking, and there were a lot more poor folk than rich folk.
Now, the simple question is, how did the poor manage to clothe themselves? As I alluded to before, there was a huge trade in secondhand clothes. Most villages would have weekly markets, and often used clothes were sold at these markets, also known as used or stolen. London, in the district of Houndsditch, was known for having many secondhand stores. So really, goodwill is nothing new at all. Clothes were often given as gifts, willed to people, and were part of the servant contract. Since many young people learned trades by being an apprentice, part of the contract was that the master had to provide clothing for the apprentice. Same with servants, so Pepys was not unusual in providing clothing for his servants. Many wealthy people showed off how well they could dress their servants. And even the wealthy are really buying secondhand clothes in this time period. And there was no shame in buying these clothes like there has been in recent memory. Fortunately, the millennial trends of being consumer and earth conscious are changing that stigma. Just like today, however, the very rich in the 17th century were the ones driving fashion and often purchasing new clothes to stay in fashion. The amount of money spent on outfitting the monarchy was truly amazing, especially if they only wore their clothes for a short period of time. Yet those very wealthy are then selling the clothes once they go out of fashion, and the lesser gentry and landed aristocracy will buy these clothes, only being a season or two out of fashion. Tailors can then make the necessary adjustments to get a good fit. The poor and middling sorts also frequent these markets and acquire clothes in this manner. The other area is that people did not just throw away clothes, they repaired them, patching them when needed, and did their best to extend the life of clothes for as long as possible.
The goal of this podcast was to try and compare two very dissimilar ideas, cars and clothing, and try to make them buying of both, cars in the 21st century and clothes in the 17th century, were one and the same. I jumped into a rabbit hole trying to make sense and quantify the rationale, looking for basic data that would prove conclusively it was the same type of transaction. It is simply impossible to figure out the amount of labor that went into producing clothes in the 17th century. Plus, it is hard to quantify the value of money in the 17th century to the present day. We did not get into analyzing consumer price index, basic inflation, or other economic variables. There are so many variables that we would get further off track than we already are in this podcast. Gregory King, a statistician of the 17th century in 1688, published a chart of income. He breaks it down to those who add to the wealth of the kingdom and those being poor and decrease the wealth. The dividing line between the two is that those who are increasing the wealth earn more than 30 pounds per year, and those who decrease the wealth earn less than 30 pounds per year. The decrease in population makes up 62% of the population, a figure he gives as 849,000 people. Now, the numbers are skewed. I am not sure how King came up with these numbers, but it does give a sense of how poor the majority of English people were in the 17th century. Someone like Edward Barlow, who is so poor he had to work in the coal delivery business earning 2 to 3 English pennies a day to save up to buy some clothes so he could go to church because all he had was rags. He later works as a sailor, learns to read and write, and keeps a journal. So the majority of people in England will have a tough time buying new clothes and will depend on acquiring clothing in the secondhand markets, having the clothes given to them as part of their wages, or simply be dressed in rags. Yet the people who earn over £30 a year are still struggling. And the further you get away from the £30, the act of buying new clothes would be expensive but manageable. Now, the carpenter earning £30 is not buying new clothes or having a lot of clothes. Still, he would be dressed appropriately for his trade. Then you have people like Samuel Pepys, who spends a small fortune on clothes, but in his position in social circles, he has no choice. Clothes really are a marker of social status in the 17th century, way more than today. Still, the question, was buying a new outfit in the 17th century close to spending $30,000 in today's money? The answer is no, and strangely, a little bit yes. Today, a good portion of the population can't buy new cars because of the economic constraints, just like the majority of English people could not afford new clothes in the 17th century. Stealing cars is common. These days, it seems to be stealing car parts like catalytic converters as a way to get easy money, just like robbing people of clothes in the 17th century. So there are similarities, just not the ones I was hoping to prove. Yet, if we go with the average Virginia salary of today, $64,607, and realize this person would have to work half a year to buy a $30,000 new car, it is similar to the outfit Pepys bought for his servant that he fired, costing £10, in that it would take the average skilled craftsman of the 1660s in England almost half a year to buy this clothing. So in that way, it is similar. The real question is, why did humans bother with clothing in the first place?
And that's something we're not getting into. But yes, clothes were expensive, but they're not the biggest expense for the majority of people in the past. That was going to be food. Still, we have demonstrated the amazing complexity and difficulty in producing clothes in the past. They were very expensive, people did look after them and tried to make them last. So while we can't figure out averages and how long it takes to make fabric and therefore go down the line into the production and wear of the clothing, we do know that many people are trying to figure out how to do it faster. Making cheap clothes was really the driving force of the Industrial Revolution. The fact that I can buy an article of clothing for 1 hour of work is an amazing achievement. Yet one part of the equation has not changed, and that is that making clothes depends on very cheap labor. Also, the question remains of, are clothes too cheap? Do we really need all the clothes we have? That becomes an entirely different rabbit hole that we're going to jump into, especially about consumerism and modern inequalities. So thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds. We bring historical episodes twice a month. And if you're more interested on this topic, be sure to join us the last week of April in 2022 for our Wool Week, where we will be talking about the very labor-intensive aspect of taking a sheep, shearing its wool, and producing fabric.
And thank you for listening, and please subscribe to the podcast. And really, if you were interested in this topic, come and visit the museum, not just for Wool Week, anytime, and we will gladly talk about fabrics.